In this session, I'm going to talk about politics and elections in journalism. To this point in the course, I have discussed general issues in reporting, such as news values, and I spent 3 weeks on interviewing technique. Now it's time to turn to specific areas of journalism, beginning with reporting on politics and elections. The next session will be reporting on crime and justice. After that, the next session will be reporting on local government. And after that, there will be a session on reporting on economics. And these 4 areas are well covered in the course text, An Introduction to News Reporting. The advantages of political coverage from the perspective of a journalist is the audience is interested in elections. So you've immediately got that audience interest. Elections have deep news values, so the coverage is justified in terms of responsible journalism. Sources are willing to talk during a campaign. The door's open. You know, people just want to talk to you during the election. The candidates want to talk to you during the election. So it's a great time for getting interviews. Another advantage of election coverage is factual data is available. You really don't have to do too much digging to get factual data. The costs of coverage are relatively low because so much information is provided with little digging. And finally, the election cycle is predictable so that it can be anticipated and planned for. Many elections are scheduled at regular times, such as municipal elections in Canada, and even the elections that aren't regularly scheduled, there's usually some sort of warning in advance that a call for an election is imminent. For one thing, the politicians need to organize in advance. They need to inform their campaign teams and their volunteers in advance, even if it's not a scheduled election. So it's not something you can keep a secret about, and it's not something you want to keep that politicians want to keep a secret about. So those elements solve a lot of routine problems in journalism. Plus, for the reporter, elections are exhilarating to cover. It gets you out of routine events. It gets you out of those dull committee meetings. But on the other side, it's also deadline writing with the story virtually due as soon as it happens. So there's that pressure of deadline writing. These days, print outlets, which have in the last few years have had to compete with broadcast outlets, and for a period of time before the internet, broadcast outlets had an advantage over print outlets because the broadcast outlets could release material right away, virtually as it's happening, and that tended to undercut print outlets. But now the internet has leveled that now, and now print outlets can compete much better with broadcast outlets through the internet. The print outlets can post their stories on the internet as fast as the broadcast media. So in other words, broadcast journalism has lost the time advantage it once had over print journalism. And now the former print outlets are internet broadcast outlets. And that's one of the reasons for the Guardian newspaper being able to survive and spread. You can break the main areas of journalism coverage into 3 newsworthy areas. First of all, politics. Second, economics. Third, disasters and crises. And these three are all related. Politics affects economics. Economics affects politics. Politics manages the recover from disasters. Disasters have economic consequences. So you see how those three areas of politics, economics, disasters, and crises are all interrelated. And in journalism, you recognize the importance of politics and economics, and you recognize the importance of the relationship between politics and economics. And that's a reason why, if you want a career in journalism, and if you want a career in freelance journalism, I know some of you in this class are thinking of freelance journalism, you should focus on politics and economics. If you're freelancing a story, you're more likely to be able to sell the story if there's an aspect of the story that has to do with politics and economics. Consequently, I suggest that while you're in university, you load up on electives in political science and economics. And this university is a great political science department, and it has a good economics department. So my advice is take electives in political science and economics. No matter what story you are writing, it's likely to have a connection to politics and economics. So I also want to mention an ethical issue in reporting on politics and elections. Politics and elections are sensitive to what the public thinks, and what the public thinks can be affected by what the public reads. Irresponsible reporting could affect an election by what is published or what is censored. So, for example, some media may want to increase the chances that a candidate it favors will get elected by suppressing stories which would damage the candidate. Not only writing stories that favor the candidate, but suppressing stories that would favor the rivals of the favored candidate. So, for example, a fairly notorious example of that is in 2016, the publisher of the tabloid, the National Enquirer, which wanted to support Donald Trump, bought a story from a woman that she had an affair with Donald Trump in order to suppress and not publish the story to prevent it from damaging the election campaign of Donald Trump. And you're probably aware that Fox News has a record of playing to the same right-wing base as Donald Trump, and the coverage of Fox News can be affecting what voters think. So there's an ethical responsibility in reporting on politics and elections. The questions that need to be answered in political reporting, the questions that general questions that you need to think about in terms of reporting on politics and election is, first of all, what types of political stories should be prioritized and why should they be prioritized? Also, how are you going to cover the political issues? For example, do you cover scandalous issues that attack a candidate but are low in substance and low in news values? Do you cover the real important political issues even if the audience is less interested in substance? Do you cover scandals or do you cover substance? Do you cover what the audience wants or do you cover what the audience needs? Even when the audience doesn't understand what it needs. Now, when I say that, a political scandal can have substance, particularly when it reveals the moral character of the politician and the politician's fitness to govern, fitness to have political power. And that's something echoed in the text, chapter 13 on reporting on politics and election. Next, are elections really won and lost on the political issues, or are they won and lost on something else? That is, are you covering the election as a contest and looking at what augments chances for winning and what augments chances for losing, or are you covering something else? So, are elections really won and lost on the political issues or won and lost on something else? And that something else that wins or loses election can be a blind spot in reporting and not discovered until the elections results show that predictions were off. So how do you identify that something else? How do you identify that blind spot in your reporting? How do you measure the effect of that something else on the election? Next, how are you going to cover the machinery and logistics of the election campaign? And what are the logistics of the campaign? Typically, the election campaign machinery in the past has been focused on persuading people to vote for a specific candidate and motivating people to vote. And that strategy was called Get the Vote Out. GTVO was the acronym. And that was the focus of the campaigns, and consequently, it was partially the focus of reporters covering the campaign and covering the campaign in terms of how well organized the campaign machinery and logistics were and how they contributed to a win or maybe contributed to a loss. So in election reporting, in that typical conventional view, as a journalist, you reported on how many volunteers a candidate had and how those volunteers were organized. And so these types of campaigns, the campaigners and the journalist looked at the demographics of specific voters and the past record of voters. So, that would happen, for example, in Kamloops. Each political party for a federal election in Kamloops would have its own data on naturally how many party members it had, how many party members got out to vote, what areas of Kamloops had strong support for the candidate, what areas of Kamloops had low support for the candidate, and they try to link those up with demographics, and they try to link that up, the demographics and the records of votes with what issues galvanize voters and what issues don't galvanize voters. So to give you a specific example of election machinery and logistics, which you'd cover as a reporter. Say take an election in Kamloops, a federal election in Kamloops. On election night, volunteers for each party would be phoning supporters before the polls close to see if they had voted yet. And if they hadn't voted, they would urge those people to vote, and they'd also arrange for a volunteer driver to take that voter to the polling station. And that's the strategy of get the vote out. That is, you're going to win by making sure that your supporters don't get lazy, or it's a rainy night or it's a cold night and they're reluctant to go out, and you're going to lose those votes. So if you did that math on the campaign trail as coverage, hypothetically, if you see that one candidate has 100 volunteers during those phone calls on election night, and the rival has 10 volunteers doing that on election night, then the candidate with 100 people getting the vote out on election night has an advantage. And so you're looking at, in your coverage, you're as a journalist, you're trying to understand what really wins and loses elections, or what are the proportions that win and lose elections. Does a candidate win an election on issues? And if he or she does, on what issues? Or does a candidate win on campaign machinery or logistics, or is there a proportion between those factors? Another thing that you cover as a journalist in politics and election are finances. How does a candidate finance an election? And what does the source of funding of the candidate indicate about the candidate? Now, the course text in chapter 13 on politics and elections, it really puts an emphasis on this issue of finances for good reason. And the text is very good in these sections on how candidates finance an election and how journalists cover that as part of the election coverage. The idea is that when a candidate accepts funding to get elected, that is, funding for the campaign, that funding may come with an obligation to do what the funder wants later. Or at the very least, the funder pumps money into the campaign for a politician that has the same values as the funder. So even if there's not, if the funding is not intended to curry favor with the candidate, there's a practical application of funding the candidate who reflects the values of the funder and is likely to promote legislation in favor of the funder. So if you own a big business, you might want to fund a candidate whose platform is to reduce taxation on big businesses. That is, the amount you put into funding the candidate will be less than the return in the reduction of your taxes. So for a really specific example of this, in the 2016 election campaign for U.S. president, Donald Trump, famously on the campaign trail, was talking about how he was using his own money for his election campaign. That wasn't true. The Mercer family of conservative billionaires spent millions of dollars to help Trump win the election just on advertising on social media organized by the firm Cambridge Analytica. So the Mercer family pumped millions of dollars into Cambridge Analytica to help get produce ads to help get Trump elected. Now, as you recall that story, Cambridge Analytica was using Facebook data illegally. Cambridge Analytica was set up by the Mercers and by Steve Bannon, and Steve Bannon was behind the Breitbart outlet. Now, interestingly enough, the same people, the Mercers, were also funding the campaign of Ted Cruz when Ted Cruz and Donald Trump were rivals for the nomination to be the Republican candidate of U.S. president. So the Mercers were really looking at what candidate will benefit us, and they saw both Ted Cruz and Donald Trump as potential benefits, and so we're willing to fund the campaigns of both of those, even though they were rivals to be the Republican candidate for U.S. president. So the point is that the source of funding for a candidate is important for coverage. Next, what is the data in an election? Elections are great for journalists because they produce lots of data. There are demographics and there are past records of votes. There are surveys and election results. The election results are released gradually on election day, which is a real benefit to the media. And why that gradual release of election results on election day is a benefit to media, it makes the election like watching a horse race or watching a boxing match or watching a sports event. You can engage your audience for a longer period of time to watch the results come in. So the election day is a great time for the media to engage an audience all day. Next, how does the national election campaign affect the local campaign? That's another angle. In some cases, local voters may be affected by how they like or dislike the national or federal leader of a political party. So in some cases, in a federal election in Canada, the candidate wants the national leader to make an appearance. And so Justin Trudeau, as the leader of the Liberal Party in Canada, makes appearances in Kamloops during election time. But in other cases, the leader may have a certain level of toxicity so that the local candidate doesn't necessarily see that as an advantage. In terms of election coverage, you want to consider how a community with diverse audiences is targeted for election coverage. That is one election story supposed to be written for all the audiences, or are the audiences segmented into different audiences? For example, the media will typically give equal airtime and equal space to all the candidates, sometimes at the same time. So you see that happening in a federal election or a municipal election in Kamloops. Typically, the newspaper will have a section where all the candidates are given equal space at the same time, or it could be sequentially. They're given the same space, but it's on sequential publication days. In the broadcast media, you see the same thing happening. Each candidate may be given so much time. It could be all at one time, or it could be sequentially at different dates. This strategy of equal time and equal space is not only fair, but it appeals to diverse audiences at the same time. And that solves the problem of the diversity of interests in a political audience. That is, with equal time and equal space, everybody's favorite candidate is representative. And that also has the advantage of allowing for side-by-side comparison. If a voter is not quite decided, these side-by-side, equal time, equal space presentations give the audience an opportunity to compare the audience. But we still got that problem in the media, in election coverage, that there are diverse audiences in election story. And the problem of how you deal with that in journalism is changing radically at this time. And it's changing because of the sophistication of the use of computers, data, feedback metrics, and algorithms. So there's a change from the traditional data collection, data usage, and campaign strategy, and the traditional ways of covering that in journalism to changes in the last few years. And I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. Another issue in the election coverage is how will resources be allocated? In any media outlet, you have a set number of reporters, editors, and photographers, and you only have a limited budget. You have to make choices of what to cover and what not to cover. And those choices that you make affect your ability to compete with viewers with other media. So an election is a political competition, but it's also a media competition. That is, the politicians are competing for attention and votes, and the media are all competing against each other for the audience. So, what principles will be used in reporting election coverage to be fair and balanced? Now, when I say that, the idea of fairness and balance in journalism, that's an idealistic concept. It helps define ethical and responsible journalism, but not all media feel ethical and responsible, and so not all media feel bound to follow principles of balance and fairness. Some media realize that it produces more revenue to be unfair and unbalanced, that it produces more revenue to echo the biases that the audience wants to hear. In a course like this in professional journalism, naturally, we are going to promote the idea of ethical, responsible journalism. Another issue is that since most media outlets have separate departments that separate news reporters from commentators and opinion writers, and that separation is often maintained in office space, so that typically news reporters are in one area of the building and commentators and writers are in another area. They may be on another floor. So there's that that ideological separation between reporters and opinion writers, and there's a physical separation in media outlets. So if we're looking at journalism in terms of opinion and commentary, what principles will be used in commentary and opinion to be fair and balanced? Another part of this issue is, where's the line between fact and opinion in reporting? Where's the line between simply reporting exactly what a politician says and contextualizing the story with inconvenient facts, contradictions, and opponents of views? Now, when you look at that line, it presents a problem. So, for example, say that you propose an extreme where the reporter will report only what the politician says. Then you run into a Trumpian situation where you're reporting lies and you're misinforming the audience. Okay, so you say, I don't want to do that. Okay, that doesn't feel responsible and ethical. I want to contextualize the story. I want to introduce facts that are inconvenient to the politician. I want to introduce contradictions in what the politician is saying. And I want to introduce views of other opponents. Well, if that goes to an extreme, it could be a way of skewing the story in an ideological way. So that's a real dilemma in reporting. Where do you draw the line between fact and opinion? Where do you draw the line between simply reporting exactly what a politician says and contextualizing the story? After the election coverage continues. So after the election, there are issues that Chapter 13 in the text examines. A really good issue, tracking how well the politician meets his or her campaign promises. That's a very lively area of political coverage. You report during the election campaign, you report the promises, and the politician makes promises to get elected. After the election, it's an area of responsibility in journalism to track how well does the politician keep his or her promises. Another area of coverage after the election, and this is also covered in Chapter 13, does the politician do a good job in representing all constituents, and not just constituents of the politician and the party who voted for him and her? Once a politician is elected, to serve all the constituents. So that's an interesting dilemma. In Kamloops, Kamloops has had a conservative federal member of parliament elected in the last two elections when the Liberal Party was defeating the Conservative Party. So in the 2015 federal election in Canada, which was a sudden sweep for the Liberal Party against the Conservative Party, which had governed for 9 years, even though in that 2015 election, the Liberal Party swept ridings in Canada, Kamloops still elected a Conservative member. And the Conservative member has continued to criticize the Liberal government. Now, Kathy McLeod, that Conservative member, she represents all constituents. So while she's criticizing the liberal government, now a minority government, she has a duty and obligation also to represent her liberal constituents fairly. And that's, as the text indicates, that's an important area of coverage. Now, so far, I've given the conventional view of political reporting, but all that may be changing because of data science. Elections are being affected by social media and data science. So suppose what we want to suppose that we want to decide that we want to cover politics and elections to follow independent news values. And by focusing on independent news values, we hope that our coverage will be fair and balanced in the public interest. So what are those news values? Think of what politics is in a democracy. A democracy is a form of self-government where citizens elect politicians who are delegated the power of the citizens to make the decisions that are in the best interests of the citizens. Now, that's different from a direct democracy where people vote directly on every decision for society. And that's direct democracy is very rare because of the problems of simply gathering everybody for vote. Right now, technology makes direct democracy possible. People could vote on every election decision online without needing a House of Parliament, using their fingerprint as identification. But is society ready for that much democracy? We really don't see it being promoted. And of course, it would put politicians out of business. So democracy is a form of self-government through elected politicians. And that is a huge form of power to make decisions that have a high impact on the lives of citizens. That's where the news value comes. That form of power to make decisions that have high impact on the lives of citizens. So, these elected politicians with delegated power, they have the power to wage wars, to fight crime, to police citizens, to set economic policy, to set taxation rates, and so on. High impact. What happens in politics affects the stock market, housing sales. That is, if you deregulate mortgages, that affects the housing market, inflation, employment, taxation, and so on and so on. So what happens politically has high impact on the lives of citizens, and that means it has high news values. Politics also affects economics, and it affects that other general news category I mentioned, disaster and crises. So how is politics involved with disasters? Well, when a hurricane or typhoon or flood or a wildfire affects people, it's called a natural disaster. But governments have a role in preparing for natural disasters to help avert the natural disaster and to help people once a disaster happens. The news angle is how well the elected politicians handle natural disasters. For example, we've got a big example in front of us right now. The COVID pandemic is a natural biological disaster. The political angle in reporting is how well governments were prepared for this kind of natural disaster of a pandemic, and how well, once it happens, the governments are helping people fight the pandemic. The economic angle is how well governments handle the economic disruption caused by the COVID virus and how well governments are handling the virus. So you see how politics, economics, and natural disasters are connected in coverage. Now, elections, datas, and polls. Chapter 13 in the text has a very good section on polls and how to cover election polls. I think the two strong points of the chapter are what it advises in terms of covering campaign finances and what it advises in terms of using election polls, election surveys. Like I said, elections are great for reporters because of the data they produce naturally, but the data is not as reliable as it seems, and reporters' use of data can lead reporters astray. For example, on November 8th, 2016, I watched the US presidential election on TV with a scorecard that I devised from a CBC story written by the CBC's official pollster predicting that Hillary Clinton would beat Donald Trump. That same night, the staff of Cambridge Analytica in the US was watching the election coverage with Trump supporters and secretly believing that Trump would lose the election and deserve to lose the election, although those staff members of Cambridge Analytica had been paid to help him win the election. Where does that insight comes from? It comes from Brittany Kaiser of Cambridge Analytica. She worked for Cambridge Analytica as an executive. And in 2019, she published her memoir called Targeted about working for Cambridge Analytica. So that an election night, some of the Cambridge Analytica staff, such as Brittany Kaiser, are expecting Trump to lose, even though they were paid to help him win. The same night, Trump is tweeting that the election is rigged because he thought he'd lost the election. The media thought that Trump couldn't win. The mainstream media was blindsided. The mainstream media had a blind spot in its election coverage, and that's a fairly recent disaster, and it's caused a lot of soul searching in the media and the coverage of elections. Now, at that time, just before the US presidential election in the fall of 2016, I was teaching this course, and I set all the students in the class out across campus as a lab exercise to survey students on campus on who they thought would win, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. The survey results from the class showed that most of those surveyed thought Hillary Clinton would win. They were intelligent students, and they followed the media. So on election night in 2016, I was using the story of a CBC pollster as a scorecard. And the CBC pollster had published on the CBC website his predictions of hour by hour as the final election results came in on election night, how many electoral college votes Hillary Clinton would have and how many Donald Trump would have. So at 8 o'clock, the pollster predicted Hillary Clinton would have this number of electoral college votes and Donald Trump would have so many. And at 9 o'clock, how much each would have, and at 10 o'clock, and so on. And out of that, I was able to devise a scorecard because I wanted to measure the accuracy of those predictions. And the outcome. The longer I watched on election night, the more the predictions were off. The more the predictions in the mainstream media were wrong. So predictions based on scientific polls are great for journalists when the polls are right, and they're disastrous blind spots for the media, for the journalists, when the polls were wrong. So how can polls be wrong? Well, it's not that the polls are wrong. The problem is the polls are only valid within a specific and limited context. So, for example, when I gave students in the class the task of surveying students on campus who they believed would win the U.S. presidential election, most said Clinton, and the results of that survey were correct. The students did believe that Clinton would win. So the survey was correct in terms of what the students believed would happen, but what they believed was different from what happened. The students who were surveyed had no expertise in polls and no expertise in election predictions. But even many of the professional polls and predictions at that time were wrong. So the problem with polls is that they only valid in a specific, limited context. And specific problems are elections are just hard to predict. It's like a horse race. Or a boxing match or a sporting event. It's a lot of fun to try and calculate and predict who will win. But those things are all difficult to predict. The favorite horse might lose. The favorite boxer might lose. The favorite sporting team might lose. And that's the same with elections. The factors can be so complex. The unknown factors can be so great. And a poll is a simplistic version of a complex situation. In 2015, the Liberal Party with Justin Trudeau surprised the country by sweeping the results in a real upset. And the Liberal Party became a majority government, putting to an end 9 years of conservative government. In 2012, in the US, Barack Obama swept into office. In 2016, Donald Trump swept into office. In 2016, the Brexit vote in England went to leave the European Union. That vote was 51.9% voting to leave the European Union. So elections are complex events that are just hard to predict. As a journalist, you may be relying on the polls produced by certain companies. And the result of those polls can reflect the interest of those who paid for the polls. And those interests can affect the results in terms of phrasing and context. Now, that doesn't mean that the poll is inaccurate in terms of context, just that it got the results appropriate to the context. For example, if you did a survey of how many people believe in that Earth is being visited by aliens in flying saucers, you could produce results over what percentage of people believe that to be true. That's not proof that aliens are visiting our planet in flying saucers. It's proof of what people believe. So in that context, the poll is right of what people believe. In terms of the reality of whether flying saucers exist, the poll is not accurate. So we have to look as journalists, we have to examine who produced and funded the poll. And for that reason, responsible journalism says it's best to use data from reliable, reputable, independent pollsters. And you always want to check, and you always want to report who financed the poll. Polls need to be done by professional standards, and that affects how you report on them. Now, the professional standards includes enough people surveyed to be statistically valid to represent a larger group. If the methodology and standards of the poll are not sound, don't use the poll, or at least report that the poll does not meet professional standards. The course text says that reporting on polls should always include the standards for professional polling, and the text lists those standards. The text says, for example, to report the margin of error, which is also called the sampling error, and the margin of error in turn is useful in determining the validity of the predictions. So a rule of thumb is that the percentage difference in points between candidates in a survey, let's say it's a simple survey of would you vote for this candidate, or which candidate would you vote for? A rule of thumb is that the percentage difference in points between the candidates should be twice the margin of error. And when it's twice the margin of error or more, you have grounds for saying that a candidate is leading in that poll at that particular point in time. Otherwise, if the percentage difference in points between the candidates is less than twice the margin of error, you should declare that it's a dead heat. If the same poll is done at 2 times, that is, you poll voters which candidate they would elect today, and 2 weeks later you poll voters again. Now you have and you have the same question. Now you have a basis of trend, and the trend allows you to make a judgment of whose support is increasing or decreasing between those 2 points and times. Now, that's all advice from the text. It's very good advice. It's very specific advice. And the text gives you examples on how to report polls. The text on page 277 lists organizations to check for standards of polls. So you, as a journalist, you're going to use polls and surveys for other situations beyond elections, and if you want to practice, ethical, responsible journalism, whenever you're reporting on polls and surveys, it should be done according to professional standards, and you should list the standards and follow that advice of the text. Other problems with polls, election polls, are the questions can be too general or too specific, and both can produce misleading results, or results that lead to interpretations that don't make sense. Numbers of statistics are often sensitive and related to context, particularly the time frame when the poll was taken. So when you're reporting a poll, you always want to give the date that the poll was taken, because events can happen the next day or the next week that would change people's minds. And so the results are only valid for the date on which they were taken. As journalists, you need to remind your audience of that. Polls are a snapshot in time at a particular moment, and people can change their minds quickly. Election polls can produce results that don't apply to the conditions of the election, and in that sense can be misleading. For example, in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, Hillary Clinton got millions more of the popular vote than Donald Trump. And yet Donald Trump won the presidential election with less of the popular vote because he won the Electoral College vote. And so that's a distinction that you as a reporter would have to understand. If you were in the United States reporting a poll on the popular vote for a U.S. Presidential candidate, that would not be reliable in terms of who might get elected. Also, when you're reporting on polls, a poll on the candidate's handling of election issues might not reflect how people actually vote. So remember at the beginning of the session, I talked about are you reporting on election issues or is something else influencing voters? So a poll on candidates' handling of election issues might not reflect how people actually vote. The polls can affect what people are thinking. So a poll results could possibly amplify a trend, increase somebody's chances for election, or decrease somebody's chances for election. Another factor in polling is people may not feel comfortable in telling pollsters what they actually believe, and so may give a deceptive answer or a socially acceptable answer. In other words, the people being polled are concealing their intentions. They're being deceptive. Another factor is that people who support a party or candidate in a poll might be too lazy to go out and vote. So if you're using the poll in terms of which candidate would you vote for, that may not be the same as what actually happens on election day, who people actually go out, whether they actually go out and vote. And of course, that gets back to the issue I talked about of get the vote out. That just because people say they want to vote for you doesn't mean they'll actually go out and vote. So you have to motivate. Candidates have to motivate people to get out and vote, which also leads to vote suppression, which we've been seeing happen in the U.S. and it's technically illegal. It's technically illegal to do things to suppress the vote, and yet in the 2020 U.S. presidential election, there was advertising that was targeting specific groups to suppress the vote, to urge them not to vote. Now, everything I've said now is the conventional view, but I also mentioned that this may be about to change, and the change comes from big data, the social media, company like Cambridge Analytica, and what happened in the 2016 U.S. presidential election and the 2020 U.S. presidential election. Now, I bring this up for two reasons. How big data, social media, and political campaigning through the social media is affecting elections is, first of all, a topic of election coverage, and as a topic of election coverage where the media has been lagging. That is, the media has been slow to wake up to the influence of using big data and algorithms and ads to influence people. Now, that's been a blind spot in reporting. So it's now an election issue, but it's also an area for journalists to consider. That is the technology now allows for data mining of individuals through Facebook, through Google, through that kind of data. And it allows organizations to build databases on preferences of individuals, then to develop ways to target those individuals and change their thinking. And the technology and the social media allow for micro-targeting of individuals. And that's in essence the why the Cambridge Analytica scandal is such a big deal. Cambridge Analytica was a communication company that accumulated vast data on individuals for social media. It created a psychographic model for predicting what would persuade people to buy products or to vote in an election. And then it micro-targeted people individually according to their profile and preferences with specific ads, and most of those ads through social media. Now, Facebook, Google, and Amazon have been doing the same thing for years. Facebook, Google, and Amazon collect data and are sources of individual data on people. They're sources of data on you. You know, if you have a Facebook account, Facebook is collecting data on you. If you use Google, Google's collecting data on you. So, Facebook and Google and Amazon is doing this well. Like I said, Facebook and Google are now among the biggest sources of advertising revenue that's being taken away from the traditional media. The point with Cambridge Analytica, which sort of burst on the scene in 2018 because of a British journalist, Carol Cadwalladr, Carol Cadwalladr in the British Observer in 2018, in the spring of 2018, published an investigation into Cambridge Analytica and its illegal use of data from Facebook that she'd been working on for some time. And Brittany Kaiser, in her 2019 memoir, From Inside Cambridge Analytica, talks about this, and Kaiser testified in government hearings about it. Another insider in Cambridge Analytica, the Canadian Christopher Wiley, he became an early whistleblower about Cambridge Analytica. Wiley published his own book on that in 2019, the same year as Brittany Kaiser. And if you want an easy way to get into this story and catch up to this story, you've probably been following it, but there's a great documentary now on Netflix called The Great Hack, and that tells the story of Cambridge Analytica with Kaiser, Wiley, and Cadwalladr. So this technological use of data, psychological profiling, and micro-targeting is now a big election issue. And it's not just an issue in terms of elections. It has to do with commerce now and economics now on the internet. So it's an important thing to learn as a a journalist. I'm seeing over time now, so I need to wrap this up. One quick final note. There's been a lot of hype about Cambridge Analytica and the scandal and its potential to persuade voters in U.S. swing states and change a U.S. election, which is a similar issue to Russian interference, which the Mueller investigation in the U.S. was looking into. There's a lot of hype and a sense of fear about the potential that Cambridge Analytica had and the plausibility that it did affect the election. But plausibility is not proof. And though it seems plausible that the methodology of Cambridge Analytica was sound and could have influenced voters and could have helped Trump get elected, there's really not solid evidence, solid research demonstrating that that Cambridge Analytica did elect Donald Trump or had a significant enough influence to swing the election. So we want to be careful about that until there's actual data and research about that.